Hey everyone, today I want to talk about perspective drawing and the 5 books that helped me the most throughout my journey learning this topic. The first two I have talked extensively here in the channel before. So we're going to be looking at their structure and how it relates to the other ones. But these other ones are options that I wanted to put on top of everything we discussed so far, because some people in the comments mentioned that they didn't have a good experience with how to draw. It was too dry of a content, too focused on like a lot of construction and so on, and sometimes a little expensive as well. So I have cheaper options. This third one, Perspective Made Easy, is even in the public domain. Maybe a creative perspective for artists and illustrators is also in the public domain. I don't know. But Andrew Lumis is a big name, so it's a great addition to all this discussion. I have a video on my study guide. I've taught perspective using How to Draw and Frame Perspective 1 for a long time. How to Draw by Scott Robertson and Frame Perspective 1 by Marcos Mateo Mastri. And I really dive deeper into why I use those and how I would break down the study into a 6-month period or something like that, adding other stuff on top, using a little bit of what I discussed in the drawing for concept art video as well. So please check that out. The link is going to be in the description. But today's, I really want to focus on the structure. If you look at courses out there from CGMA to New Masters Academy, and we're going to look a little bit at New Masters Academy because I learned a lot from there. If you follow the channel long enough, you already know that. Eric Olson is my guru on perspective, as well as Gary Meyer. So I go with that direction, but we're going to see that the topics really repeat themselves. So if we look here, this is how to draw a structure on the left and Frame Perspective 1. But all we can see is like materials and basic use of draftsmanship. A lot of them will go here and start with the basics, your whole experience with the materials and getting your lines better, line quality, and so on. Then it goes to terminology and the basic concepts. You can see the basics here in Frame Perspective 1. It jumps into techniques. You can see some techniques in these 2 chapters here, talking about like the flex surface and the cube. So dividing and repeating measurements in perspective, it's all about what's going to be taught here. Grids in the Frame Perspective 1 are spread out in the 2, 3, and multiple vanishing point structures, but it has a lot of those discussions as well. And then ellipses, it go into that. Frame Perspective 1 goes into inclined planes first. This is something that I feel that is lacking in How to Draw, and you see in other books that they cover this topic as well. Then bending the line is basically ellipses. How to Draw goes into specifics, so volumes, and I'm gonna use some examples from my journey as well as from the book, and some things that I taught that I think are really valuable and you can basically only find on How to Draw. So I would definitely give a lot of attention for this. I've discussed this on the other video on my suggestion on how to study. But Marcos Mateo Mastri goes into elevation, something that I don't really like that much. You see that successful drawing also goes in this direction. Lenses in more broad notes on observational drawing and composition that Marcos Mateo Mastri is really, really good at. He has framed Ink 1 and 2 to really prove, and his whole career as a layout artist to prove how good he is in that. So jumping into How to Draw, I think this is the most important part that is not very well covered in other books and other content out there. It's mirroring curves and using those curves in constructions of complex volumes. So this is the technique. Basically, you use a lot of reference guidelines to really throw one curve into the other side and mirror them. And you can do that in the flat plane, but you can also do that in perspective. This is super valuable when you're looking at real world problems, and especially if you're looking at a scenario where you can't see the curve. So the curve comes here and we can clearly see that, but it goes behind this structure over here. So to understand what's behind, so it's the basic fundamentals of draw through. If you heard this term before, basically it is seeing the other side of the drawing that wouldn't be visible from the angle you're looking at that. So this is true for a lot of objects. You can only see one side. The other side you need to imply. If you want to give it volume, especially if you have multiple primitives, you have a cylinder, a sphere, and you want in a cube, and you want to put all of those in the same space, for them to not overlap, or even if you want to overlap them. I've talked about dynamic sketching here on the channel. It's basically getting a lot of primitives and doing some transformations on them and combining them to get to the complex object that you're trying to convey, you're trying to describe. So this is where, using this kind of constructions, you will have this X-ray vision and have a grasp of the overall volume. This is super useful when you go into the two curve combo situations that he explains in the book. This is where looking the other side will be important, especially when you get more and more complex. So something like this. These are some exercises I did. So having this understanding of the other side is really important. We've talked about this on other videos. So more exercises and you really have a grasp of what we're talking about. Be careful with like the inclined planes. I think a lot of my students stop working with this book and stop enjoying once they get to this. I would highly recommend skipping it. If this ever gets to Scott, I would love him to remove that potentially from the book, or like throw it to the end of the book as extra appendix material, because it's really throwing off a lot of people that don't understand what's happening there. I don't like the construction I did here. I think it's a little bit wrong as well, but it's all to really reinforce that this is a difficult exercise. So going back to those three books, I want to go through each and every one of those one at a time, looking at their structure, what they are talking about, and some examples of their content, so that you can choose whatever works best for you. Perspective Made Easy is the one that we're going to start with. It's the cheapest option and the most accessible in terms of the pace of the contents. If we look here, what it's covering, we can see that it starts step by step with all the basic fundamentals. What's the eye level, how it relates to parallel lines, and how they converge in perspective. There are 3 sets of parallel lines when you're talking about boxes. So understanding rotation and the third point and the angle with which you're looking at stuff, it's really important. Goes deeper into 2 vanishing points and construction in this space, especially the closeness between and the error of putting together the 2 vanishing points too close. This is very good and very well explained. We're gonna look at some pages later on. Then it goes into the relationship between those 2 vanishing points and how it changes when you're rotating. This is one of the most asked questions. How can you maintain consistency? It's super hard, and I tend to go with perception as the main way to really rotate. You can't construct everything and use like even math to construct everything, but it's not needed. It's a lot of practice, in my opinion. So building bricks and using bricks to construct things. We've talked a lot about this in my video on perspective for concept art, using the foundation group tutorials and really building on top of grids with boxes and primitives and finding that perspective. There is a lot of discussions on a lot of the topics that are here in that video as well. The link's in the description. And then it goes into like the center of interest, roofs, so inclined planes, and start getting more and more complicated, using the bricks as in the videos that we discussed to build an interior and placing on furniture. Marcos Mateo Mestre does a lot of this in Frame Perspective 1. I think that's a very good high point of Marcos Mateo, as he's using that for layout, for animation. He's also teaching that through his book as well. Then using more of those tools, so finding the center, dividing, and replicating measurement in perspective, scale for figures, and so on. Cylinders, and start the ellipses process that is very hard and is going to be very useful. So dividing those ellipses, dividing the surface and creating grids like a checkerboard. And then it changes from how to draw in Frame Perspective 1 and goes more into what Scott Robertson discusses in how to render in Marcos Mateo in Frame Perspective 2. That is shadow projections and reflections, and then goes into more unusual perspective and more inclined planes, downhill, uphill, and so on. So looking at some of the pages here, you can see that it's very, very educational and goes step by step, like using this railway lines to explain convergency and vanishing points. It always has this remember and problems part in the end of each chapter, so you can have a summary of what it was learned and how to apply that in very direct exercises. You can pause the video and take a look and read through those. It's really interesting, or even get the book. It's on public domain. I love this example of understanding the horizon line as if you're filling the room with water. So it's really useful to understand what's above and what's below the horizon line and how it will relate to the viewer. So a lot of other examples of convergency and the bricks and furniture. Once again, remember and problems, using the two vanishing points and how to build that. The problem with placing the 2 points too close to each other that we talked before, and we talked on the video about perspective for concept art as well. Using the bricks, there is an exercise in how to draw that is very similar to this, and building cities with that, scales of people in perspective. What I said before of using primitives and being mindful of the chance of overlapping in the three-dimensional space. If you want to overlap them, if you want to combine them, this is the beginning of everything. So this is the beginning of dynamic sketching as well. Looking at interiors from different angles and how to build them, and inclined planes and getting more and more complex, dividing ellipses and using them to build objects. I've discussed this a lot. I have a video on drawing around the house and drawing objects that is really on this side as well and really useful. Checkerbox and grids, shadow projections, and a little bit of the inclined planes that we discussed before. So jumping to the next one, we're going to talk about creative perspective for artists and illustrators by Ernest Watson. The first one was by Ernest Norling. I forgot to mention that. So going once again to the contents, this book is the basis of Marshall Vandroof's course. So this is also another resource for you guys to check out. I'll have a link in the description for his channel and his video. It's an old course, but it's really based on primitives and construction through primitives. So once again, materials, concepts and the structural approach, and then it goes really into squares, the picture plane, and then cube for shortening and convergency. So some of the concepts: circle, cone, inclined plane, so that would be a little bit of pyramids as well. Floor tiles, so checker box once again, grids and so on. Inclined planes once again with stairs and up and downhill. 3-point perspective, reflections, shadows, that we discussed before, and going into more complex scenes with furniture and so on, universal perspective, and some more complex problems of putting figures and really more complex elements in your scene. So looking at the content here, it's really interesting. And as I said before, they really go into the primitives approach. So even building out stuff. Nowadays we have 3D. So you can definitely use 3D to place stuff in perspective, but having a physical object to draw all the time, and you can even use a line to place them higher than the viewer and so on, or do some combinations between them, cut them and paste them together. All this kind of stuff is very useful, especially doing boxes. I love the concept of drawing 200 boxes from Draw a Box. They have a challenge there and all of that. But doing that without any type of reference, it can be really harmful because you're repeating a lot of the mistakes that you're doing. All drawing, I think it's useful. You will learn something, but drawing 200 boxes from reference in different angles above and below the eye level with different configurations, facing different planes and in different angles will really, really be helpful. And having the physical object will go a long way. So he breaks down complex subjects into those primitives is pretty much what dynamic sketching does. So a lot of the basis of dynamic sketching here as well. So you can see a lot of examples, even more complex examples of architecture, breaking those down, dividing them, and combining some of the primitives that we talked before. So going into the cube and having more of this construction that we've seen both in how to draw as well as perspective made easy. Railway lines, always very useful to understand convergency and vanishing points because they are kind of infinite, so you can see them going to the horizon and so on. Cylinders, so getting more complex with minor axes and perspective. I love that this is also really commonly done in dynamic sketching, drawing a train, because it's basically a combination of a lot of primitives. Cylinders, boxes, even cones sometimes. So it's basically that, and you can see a little bit of the breakdown in here. You can go as complex as you want. So this is a very interesting reference to draw from. Architecture, you can find buildings like this around your city as well. Inclined planes, so the House of Seven Vanishing Points. I love the title of this chapter. A lot of complexity, but very manageable complexity. You need to understand auxiliary vanishing points, but once you do, everything tends to fall into place and be really manageable. Checker box, once again, getting more and more complex. Staircase, I really love drawing staircases. If you've seen my video on drawing an interior, the drawing around the house video has a little bit of a time lapse of what I did there. And I love drawing this subject matter. I should definitely do more. And once again, getting more and more complex as it should be. Shadow projections. This is hard. Projecting the shadow of a box with all the lids open. Books will follow into this category as well. You can see dividing also the circles and ellipses so that you can place the lid in different angles. This is really important, and you see that in how to draw as well very much. Projections of hanging volumes and planes. This is discussed really in depth in how to render in frame perspective 1. I've done a lot of exercises like this. They are super useful, and I'll do a video on how to render down the line as well. And some of the examples, there are great examples by amazing artists that did these constructions to really have a grasp of what they were doing. And shadow projection on stairs, really hard, but really interesting exercise. And you start really observing the world around you and how the shadows work. And I think one of the most important, scale of perspectives in relation to the eye level. We are usually doing illustrations and constructions and even concepts that need to show scale. So having the human figure is a very good way, and illustrations with a lot of figures, you really need to understand how they relate to each other and to the eye level as well. Last but not least, let's jump into Andrew Lumis, this amazing person and artist and educator. This book starts with potentially one of the best chapters on the fundamentals. We're going to look at some of those pages, but the 5 P's and 5 C's concept, and really diving into what makes an image and how this is going to relate to the rest of the book, laying some of the foundations of what's going to be discussed. And in practical terms, is very focused, as well as creative perspective for artists and illustrators, on the construction using primitives. So the square and the cube, cylinder and the circle, the cone and the sphere, and so on, and how you combine those to create more complex things. It's going to go into all the topics that we said before, the single vanishing point, 2 points, and you can take your time and pause the video and really read through this. I think it gives more context of what is in the book than anything else, going through the table of contents, the index, and so on. So once again, more tools, spacing, equal spacing of solids, unequal spacing, and how to do that. Simple projection. I don't like very much, to be honest, the plan and elevation projections, and successful drawing really goes into that, as we saw with frame perspective 1. So I think this is the downside, and it can be very constructive driven, which I personally find really awesome, but some people can be thrown off, and we are going to see examples going forward. So how to draw a curved surface, so ellipses, once again, interiors from elevation. It tends to go back because it's a little dated, and they use a lot of those elevations, especially in architecture drawing. So it tends to go a little bit to that. Figures, measurements, the perspective in relation to the eye level. Once again, you see that we tend to go back to the same topics over and over again. It doesn't matter what the book is. This book, as it's on fundamentals more broadly, it goes into values and lights. So projections a little bit, but going into lights falling on planes and the complex forms and how that relates to the overall shadow projection, and even the values, the value fallouts, and all of that in the form. And the form can be as simple as the primitives that we discussed before, but successful drawing also goes into the mannequin and using a little bit of the figure construction, light falling in the figure as well. Some example of even portraits and drawing costume. So it's a little bit of a combination of frame perspective 1 and frame perspective 2 by Marcos Mateo Mestre. You can put all those 2 books together, and it's basically the topics that are being covered with a different intention and a different application, more on the layout design than this kind of illustrations that were done by Lumis back in the day. So you have, like, I don't know, 50 years difference between those books coming out, or 40 years difference between them coming out. So you can really see the application differs, but the concepts are the same. So basically, perspective and light, we have been talking about this at least since the Renaissance, when those concepts were really discovered or fleshed out or equated in terms of the math that they have and so on. So this is what we're using. So it's basically the same content. Looking at the pages here, we can definitely see the use of the primitives to simplify complex objects. So you can see the house, objects around the house using the cylinders, cones, a lot of what we've seen on the other books, creative perspective for artists and illustrators more specifically. This is great. This is the construction that I said before. This is worth having the book only if just for this and reading through what he says about this. So the 5 P's are basic, the construction of the image, so proportion, the placement of things in the three-dimensional space, and the relationship with the eye level that will need the perspective understanding to really construct things, understanding the planes and breaking down complex structures into those planes, and patterns to form the overall readability of the image. This is all the elements needed to get to a final image. Well, and these are the concepts that go behind it. So the conception and even like a process driven. So the conception of the image, so rough indication, this is really important in perspective as well, as you are fleshing things out and getting more of the line quality later on, especially if you're drawing digitally, you can definitely do that. The overall construction, contour lines, and the final line that you're using, the character and their expression. So giving time, because heads and hands are gonna really be conveying the personality that you want to convey. And I really want to reinforce that he mostly talks about illustration and not concept and so on. So this is really important in the illustration side, and consistency in all of those elements and everything that is being done on the image. You can definitely break consistency and use that in your favor, but it depends on intentionality as well. So more example, as I said before, it's a little more on the constructive, so it can throw off some people, but I really find it important to have. How to draw, we've seen this, the draw through, and the use of the structuring and the construction to have an X-ray view, using the ellipses to draw cylinders and more complex forms. Then grids, and really understanding your space and placing some of those cylinders with the objects that you have. The relationship, the spacing that I said before, this is really strong on frame perspective 1. I love the way Marcos Mateo teaches that as well, but it's really good here in this book. This is the part that I don't like, to be honest, once again. Elevations and projections, it's useful to some extent, but it's very technical as well. If you want to have the exact measurements in your drawing, nowadays I highly recommend doing a 3D model or something like that, and just drawing on top of that and having that as a basis, as an underlay for your drawing and so on, that you don't need this. I think it's super nice to understand what's happening and really teach your perception how to do this with your eyes. It's better than going through the overall construction and so on. So furnitures, this example here is really close to what Gary Meyer teaches in his Gnomon School, as well as New Masters Academy courses, how to use the grids to place objects in a room, in an interior. So really important as a concept. We discussed this on the perspective for concept art video. Inclined planes, auxiliary vanishing points. So I'm being really repetitive here, and I think it's important for you all to understand what are the basic concepts and what should I learn in perspective. Some more complex topics, when they have both an inclination in relationship to the horizon line, but also a little bit of a tilt. So that will make the drawing harder and harder. Placing figures and the projection of figures in different places of the three-dimensional space, the relationship with the eye level. This is really important. This is a concept that really you need to grasp for everything, especially if you are doing environment concept art or illustration that are very figure-driven and scale-driven. This is really important. Reflection, and I really took off from here the part that is more on the values and so on. So you definitely should go directly to the book if you want to see more of that. So last but not least, I want to go through the content in New Masters Academy, where I learned from Eric Olson. They are reorganizing the overall structure of the course, but you can see basically the same concepts that we've been discussing so far. So an intro to perspective, the measurements and tools that we've seen before, the cone of vision, so back to basic concepts, referencing size and scale and spaces, ellipses and their construction, one-point perspective, really diving deeper, looking up and down in one-point perspective. So starting to get an understanding of placing the observer in different points of view so that you can draw the same room from the top, for example, here, and understand the placement, the grid, the proportions, and so on. So drawing with those ellipses that we've said before, going into more 1 point and 2 points. So starting to change the angle to get to that 2 point, diminishing guide. So creating grids that will guide your placement of the objects and so on, breaking down stuff into points and getting more and more complex and building scenes into point perspective. So this is the start of everything. As I said, they are organizing the course that has more than 100 hours of content. So those 12 are the beginning steps. Then it goes more into volumes as how to draw. So it's really great that it goes, and it's really step by step with a lot of diagrams for you to do and copy. I did a lot of on my own. I think I did more than 100 of those throughout my studies. So yeah, that's it for me. I hope this was useful for you. As I said before, we've covered these topics using how to draw in frame perspective 1 first, then using the tutorials from Foundation Group in a second video. And now I want to use those 3 extra books and the combination of everything to really try and convey what perspective is all about and how you can learn it step by step, cover all the topics. Sometimes inclined planes are not going to be taught as how to draw, as I said before. So you need that information. It's going to be super useful. So go look that up in another source. If you want something that is more slower pace, go with Perspective Made Easy. If you want more like dynamic sketching, focus on primitives, Creative Perspective for artists and illustrators, or Successful Drawing. But I think Creative Perspective is better in that sense. Marshall Vandroth's course focuses a lot on that, as well as Eric Olson's course in the Masters Academy really covers a lot of everything that you've seen in all those books in a very step-by-step course. This is not a simple topic. It can be a little dry. So find your own pace. Go step by step. I wish you the best on your studies. Let's have conversations here on the comments of your major difficulties and challenges so that everyone can help each other and we learn together this complex topic that is perspective, but is the basis of everything that we're going to do next. Have great studies. Have a great day, and I hope to catch up in other videos. Bye.